Stanford University.
My name is Andy DiPaolo. I'm the former Senior Associate Dean of the Engineering School at Stanford University and Executive Director Emeritus of the Stanford Center for Professional Development. I'm here today to do an oral history conversation with Joe Goodman. And let me tell you a little bit about Joe before we begin the conversation. Joe Goodman is the William Ayer Professor of Electrical Engineering, Emeritus in the Department of Electrical Engineering. He received his undergrad degree from Harvard and his master's and PhD from Stanford University. And for nearly 60 years, through his retirement in January of 2001, he's held various positions at Stanford, including Professor of Electrical Engineering, Department Chair, Senior Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs in the Engineering School, and as an acting Dean. Professor Goodman is the author of 4 major textbooks, Introduction to Fourier Optics, which is this absolute standard text in the field, Statistical Optics, Speckle Phenomenon Optics, and with Bob Gray, Fourier Transforms and Introduction for Engineers. He has also authored more than 200 scientific and technical papers and served as a PhD advisor for 49 students. Professor Goodman has received numerous awards, honors, and recognition from groups such as the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, the American Society of Engineering Education, the Optical Society of America, and the Society of Photo-Optical Instrumentation Engineers, including the highest awards given by the latter 2 societies. An active participant in industry development, he co-founded Optivision, Robertson Company Publishers, Nano Precision Products, and O&I Systems. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I recommend you review his curriculum vitae for specific details regarding his distinguished career. There's something else about Joe that I've gleaned from my interviews with colleagues and former students, and let me just read a few comments. These are quotes. "I was always impressed with the clarity of Professor Goodman's thought and expression in the classroom and in the lab." Another, "He applied a methodical yet unpretentious approach to teaching physical and mathematical concepts with a wonderful sense of humor that is subtle and elegant. It's my firm belief that had Stanford failed to offer him an academic appointment, he would have become a successful stand-up comedian." A third quote, "The values that Joe has impressed upon me simply by being who he is and how he conducts himself are integrity, honesty, kindness, humility, tolerance, generosity, loyalty to friends and family, love of nature, and genuine respect for all beings." And the last, "In the most profound sense of the word, Joe Goodman has been a true educator, and I could not have found a better role model anywhere in the world." On a personal note, Joe was the chair when I came to Stanford in 1988 and had a chance to work with him in a variety of capacities. And I have to tell you that during the many experiences I've had with Joe, what his students have said is exactly what I observed. So today I'm delighted to spend time with Joe and doing his oral history for the Stanford Historical Society. Joe, thanks for coming today. I really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So we're going to have a deep dive on your experience at Stanford
Okay.
over the last 60 years. It's a long time to be in one place, but you have a lot to share, and I know people will be interested in hearing about your experiences and what happened while you're here. But let's go back in time. Let's go back to when you were a child. I believe you were born in Boston. Your dad was a dermatologist. Can you tell us a little bit about that early experience? What formed your thinking and your interest in moving into engineering?
My mother was an anesthesiologist, by the way, so I come from a medical family. And my parents were divorced when I was about 10, and my mother is the one who really stimulated my interest in science. And when I was a teenager, I got interested in ham radio, and she encouraged me, and so I got my ham license, and I used to interact with a lot of people by both code and voice. And that experience, the ham radio experience, really determined in my mind that I wanted to be an electrical engineer.
Interesting. There was no push to be involved in medicine? Like
no push, no. no push.
Good. So where did you go to high school?
I went to a prep school in Massachusetts, Phillips Andover Academy,
Right.
for 3 years. I went to 1 year public high school and then 3 years at Andover.
And any brothers and sisters?
I have one brother who's 2 years younger, lives in Oakland. He is retired, like me.
And what was his profession?
That's a bag of worms, Andy.
Was he also moving into a scientific and engineering field?
No, no. He majored in French and English at Dartmouth, and he has had a variety of business experiences, ranging from running a travel agency that specialized in the South Sea Islands to running a gymnasium that catered to bodybuilders.
That's a range.
It's a range.
It's a range. So you went from high school to Phillips, and then you went to Harvard.
That's correct.
Talk about that experience a bit.
Yeah, the amazing thing is, in those days, the person at Andover who gave advice on what colleges to apply to, my father had gone to Harvard and Harvard Medical School, so I guess I wanted to go to Harvard too. And he said, well, don't apply anywhere else. Just apply to Harvard. Either he had a lot of influence.
That's risky.
either he had a lot of influence, or else it was easier in those days.
Right.
So I went to Harvard and had 4 great years there. I'd like to tell you about what I admired about the Harvard program.
Yeah.
At Harvard, the word engineering was bordering on a dirty word. Harvard was very science-oriented. My major was engineering and applied physics, it was called at that time. And I really liked the Harvard program because you learned just enough engineering to get into graduate school in engineering, but you had the chance to take an extremely broad set of courses, history of music, history of art. You know, it was a great experience. And I sometimes am approached by high school students who are lucky enough to be admitted to Stanford and Harvard, and I try to judge, how much they would value a really broad education. I would place Stanford kind of between Harvard and MIT. Harvard, extremely broad education in those days. MIT, much more narrow and specialized. Stanford is kind of in the middle between them. So
that's been my take, because students at Stanford are admitted to the university, not to a specific school.
That's right. They can major in anything they want to.
And so we're not Stanford Tech.
Right.
It's a wonderful liberal arts school, the strengths are in some
and
of the
the challenge is to make sure they take advantage of that.
Right.
Yeah.
So there was when you were at Harvard, I believe you met Tony Siegmund from Stanford. Is that correct?
Yes. When I was a senior at Harvard, I forget just when this was, maybe in the fall quarter, we were all thinking about graduate school, and Tony Siegmund, who was then an assistant professor, came to Harvard to recruit for EE at Stanford.
Really?
Yeah, and it was a terrific job he did. I had at Harvard an advisor by the name of C. Lester Hogan. And C. Lester Hogan, I'll tell you what he advised me in a minute, but just to review his career, he left Harvard and became head of Motorola Semiconductor. He left Motorola Semiconductor and became head of Fairchild Semiconductor. Wow. So he was a very accomplished guy. Anyway, his advice to me while he was a Harvard professor was, I told him I wanted to go to the West Coast. I'd lived my whole life in the East Coast around Boston. I wanted to experience a little different life, and so I told him I wanted to go to the West Coast, and I applied to Caltech and to Stanford for graduate school. And I got admitted to both, and he advised me to come to Stanford. He thought Stanford's program was better at that particular point in time, which was
he your advisor then?
He was my advisor at Harvard, yeah.
Right, very interesting.
So that's how I got to Stanford.
So you came to Stanford, and what was that experience like as a graduate student and research assistant?
Yeah. The first thing you notice, having come from somewhere else, is the character of the undergraduate population. And in those days, 1958, 1960, the undergraduate population was consisted mostly of children of wealthy Californians. It wasn't the international kind of institution it is now, with such tremendous diversity in terms of geography of where people come from and so forth. And
did you feel out of place because you?
No, I didn't feel out of place. No, because the graduate student population was very mixed even at that time. So I made a lot of friends in graduate school. I had a very good advisor and associate advisor, and I should tell you, I worked in the Applied Electronics Laboratory. That was the building.
Right.
And in those days, the Applied Electronics Laboratory was a secure facility. You had to have a security clearance.
It was a classified research going on?
There was classified research going.
Right.
And I did my PhD thesis in that laboratory, and it was classified as soon as I handed it in. I never saw it again, my thesis, until around 2005, when Bill Rambo, who had been head of the Stanford Electronics Laboratories, long since retired, but he managed to break it away from being classified. And I had a lot of help from the Hoover Institution, too.
Oh.
The Hoover Institution helped break it away from classification.
How did they do that?
Don't ask me. They pulled strings, you know.
So were you involved when then SRI was spun out?
Yes, I was.
And can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, we had a very tumultuous time on campus around 1969. We had threats of burning buildings, particularly the Electronics Research Lab. We had broken windows. We had threats to burn down the computer facility. And my graduate students of that time remember more than anything else the fact that the EE faculty, many of which were housed in the Electronics Research Lab, formed teams of their PhD students, faculty and students, and we stood guard on the top of ERL at night, not to fight off any intruders, but rather to call the fire department if there was a firebomb thrown. And so my graduate students of that period remember this probably more than anything else about their graduate stay here.
I would think. And so I'm going to revisit that in a little bit, but I'm curious about the SRI.
The SRI, yeah. The SRI exit from Stanford was earlier. It happened, I think, before Stanford stopped classified research. And it didn't impact us particularly. It was simply a separation at the administrative heads of the two entities.
Right.
Instead of the Stanford Board of Trustees being the main controller of SRI, they had their own board of directors and so forth. So I would say that had no impact whatsoever. For me, there were a few people for which it had an impact, people who had work going on at SRI as well as Stanford.
I'm going to come back to that era of the Vietnam War. The few questions in a little bit, but I want to go back to in some chronological order the fact that you went from a graduate student and then you became a research assistant.
Research associate. Yeah, I was a research assistant as a graduate student.
Right.
When I got my PhD, actually I got it in January of '63, but I finished my work in fall of '62, and I went on a postdoctoral fellowship to Norway.
I'm going to come to that. I have some questions on that as well.
And I was actually married in Norway, and so
this is good. Hold those.
Then I came back to Stanford afterwards,
right,
as a research associate.
So that period when you were finishing your graduate degree, your PhD, and then eventually when you came back to the department, what was the EE department like? What kinds of things were going on? at that time?
Well, John Linville was chair. We were beginning, the buildup of semiconductors and integrated circuits was beginning. Jim Meindl was hired somewhere in that time frame. Integrated circuits became more and more important. And I think John Linville is the one who brought Stanford, he's the primary one who brought Stanford from the tube ages into the semiconductor ages.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you have any time? I know there was also a transition at that point from Fred Terman to Joe Pettit.
That's right.
What was that? Were you in the middle of that? What was that like as an observer?
I think that I came in 1958 in the very year that Joe Pettit started as dean, I think. Mm-hmm. But Terman was not dean when I came. And, I think the change probably had little effect because I think Terman still had a very watchful eye over engineering. Right. In fact, I was told, well, this is getting a little ahead of the story, but I was told by someone that, I have to go back and say that I changed fields when I came back to Stanford, from radar countermeasures to optics. And in 1963, commercial lasers were just becoming available. And there was a group in the Applied Electronics Lab that had a contract from the Air Force to see what lasers were good for. And one of the things that was very popular and very exciting at the time was holography. Yeah. And so I got involved in holography. And the rumor I heard was that Fred Terman told the EE department, you should appoint someone in this sort of modern optics area, not lasers. Lasers was well covered already by Tony Siegman and later by Steve Harris and Bob Ayer, but rather in this other area of optics that was clearly had a lot of relevance to electrical engineering and was just kind of blossoming.
And that was you?
And I was there at the right time, yeah. I would say also that Ralph Smith, who nowadays probably nobody remembers, but I do. Ralph Smith was a great teacher here. He wrote the kind of most popular first year book on electronics for seniors or first year grad students. Anyway, he was a great teacher, and I had taught a course as a graduate student under his direction on circuits. And he liked the job I did, evidently, because he was a big supporter of appointing me as an assistant professor because he thought I would be a good teacher.
So you taught it when you were a research associate?
I taught one course when I was a graduate student under his supervision. Then when I was a research associate, they allowed me to teach a course on Fourier optics. Right. And that's when I sort of started. I wrote class notes and kind of get started on the book that way.
So what was it that caused you to transform? Was it at the encouragement of people in the department, or was it your own review of what was happening in the field? What to change?
Yeah, I would say there was a lot of luck involved because when I came back, this contract existed for applications of lasers. I was offered a job in that group, and it was a very exciting new area. My background, which was really in communication theory, was very well suited to go into that field, and I just changed fields. It seemed like a good thing to do.
And that became the basis for your first book?
Yes. And we should finish the story on that Applied Electronics Lab, because shortly after all these demonstrations about the Vietnam War and so forth, the university decided not to do any more classified research. And I thought that was a good decision, actually. Right. And as a consequence, that group at the Applied Electronics Lab split up. More than one half went to SRI, And the remainder founded a company called Argo Systems, which was very heavily involved in building radar countermeasure equipment for the government. Founded by my office mate, Bill May, and they were very successful and eventually bought by Boeing. So anyway, there was that split when the classified research left. The people working on classified research mostly left.
Let me stay on that theme for a second and jump up. I have a note that in 1985, you were I think the first Stanford researcher to be offered financing by the Reagan administration for the SDI and Star Wars.
Yes,
and there were some issues that surfaced. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, the work that I was funded to do was not that different from the work that I was funded by NSF and others to do. I mean, it was kind of a closely related work, but the fact that it was funded under the Star Wars program caused a stir.
In what sense?
In the sense that one of the local TV stations came down to interview me in my office. And you know, it's one of those things where you generally assume the worst, that somehow, you know, the research was unethical or wasteful or something. I don't know exactly what, but it actually was pretty much the same kind of thing that I've been doing all along.
And did that controversy eventually just
it eventually dissipated. Yeah.
Right. You know, I'm still curious about this issue around the confidentiality and the classified research.
Yeah.
Was your dissertation the last classified research?
I think it was. Yes.
I think that's true from what I've been able to dig out a little bit on that.
I think that's right.
The other is, now let's go back to, you started the conversation about your postdoc in Norway. So
yes.
You want to talk a little bit, that was in 62, 63.
Sure.
And so what was that experience like?
Norway was cold.
Yeah, I've been there in February. I know what you're saying. It's very dark.
And very dark, very dark. Norway, you know, was a very different country than it is now, because there was no North Sea oil in 1962, 63. Right. It was not a wealthy country. There was a very noticeable, we went back in 73 in the summer. There's a very noticeable difference between the character of the people in the winter and in the summer. In the winter, they walk along the streets with their heads down and they never say hello or anything. And in the summer, you know, they're the most friendly people. Right. So it was cold. I don't think I ever saw the ground without snow on it, because I was there for 6 months. And absence makes the heart grow fonder. And as a consequence, I proposed to a young lady who had been my girlfriend over here at Stanford. I'd met her off campus, actually. And after
go back, I understand there's something about landlord connecting the two of you in some way?
Yes, we lived in an apartment. We lived in this, my last year as a graduate student, we lived in the same apartment house. She here, another apartment, me and another roommate here. She had a roommate too. So that's how we met.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And she's a native of Macau.
She's a native of Macau. She had
dietitian?
a Portuguese passport.
Right, and she went to Clark College, I think.
She went to, gee, you know a lot, Andy.
Well, done my digging a little bit. And so two very different career paths, but
yeah.
And eventually, I know she helped you as a support for editing a journal as well.
Yes, she did.
Right.
Yes, that came later, but she was the assistant editor officially, and I was the editor.
So you got together. She came, and you were married in Norway.
She came to Norway. We were married in Norway. This may be a little more than you wanted to know, but when she came to Norway, we were flying. I met her in Denmark. We were flying to Norway. The main airport in Oslo was fogged in. So we landed at a military airport, and they never checked passports. And we found out a little bit, we noticed a little bit later that she had a Portuguese passport. In those days, they wrote the countries for which it was valid in the passport. Oh. And Norway was not one of them. So we had a little bit of.
So she snuck in illegally.
She was an illegal immigrant, right?
That's funny.
So we got that straightened out with the Portuguese consulate there, and we were married in the Oslo City Hall. A Norwegian ceremony, entirely in Norwegian. We have no idea what was said.
Yes.
But we had one of the one of the staff of the American consulate there as a witness, and provided us with an English.
Very unique.
Yeah, it was
Certainly memorable for doing that. So you returned to Stanford in '63 as a research associate. That we talked a little bit about exploring the application of lasers already.
Right.
And there's a note as well about that the summer course you taught in foray optics, which became your first book. And we talked a little bit about why you changed your research path. Then you were appointed as an assistant professor.
That's right, 67.
And that was the Vietnam era. We talked a little bit about that. Have we left out anything? That's the era when Bruce Franklin was inciting anti-war protests on campus. And anything other way that impacted you or your students or the department?
Yeah, well, the Applied Electronics building was occupied for a week or two.
Yes.
And I couldn't go to my office. I still had my office in those days in the Applied Electronics building, even though I was not doing classified research anymore. So it was that period, and I have great admiration for President Lyman, who was the you may recall we had, what was his name, the fellow from Berkeley, chemist, who was president.
Mays?
I want to say Pincer or something.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
He was president for 2 years, I think, and he couldn't take the Vietnam War protests. He just didn't know what to do about it, and so he left, and Lyman was appointed president.
So what was it he did that you felt he did the right thing? How did he handle it?
Well, when there was a demonstration in front of the ERL and people were being prevented from going in, he came out personally and stood there and said, you have to disperse. If you don't, if you keep preventing people from doing their work, then there are going to be consequences for you from Stanford. And that was enough to tamp the whole thing down. Right. Yeah.
And the end game of that was there constant tension during the Vietnam War, though, still, even though it may not have been protests? Did you feel it in the department in some way?
I do recall that after I moved from the Applied Electronics Lab to the Durand building, there was one night when a lot of windows in the Durand building were broken. And my office was covered with broken glass. I don't quite remember what year that
building? Is that what it was?
I was on the first floor in the corner, yeah.
Right. And then, you began your progression, and you moved fairly rapidly from assistant to associate, a very brief period of time.
Yeah,
I had the consequence of the book and the notoriety and
the fact that I'd really been doing research at Stanford already for 4 years, and had quite a few publications and a book. Yes. Well, no, the book actually was published in '68.
Okay.
So it must have been a combination of the teaching and the research publications.
So what during that period? What were the courses that you were teaching? What kinds of things were you doing?
Well, I started out actually, as I mentioned, as a research associate teaching a course on foray optics, and then once I became a professor, I continued to teach foray optics. I started to introduce a course on statistical problems in optics. In addition, in various years, I taught circuits, I taught E&M theory. What else? That's about it, I think.
And I saw something in my reading about you, that you had a student PhD student older than you, Al Makovsky.
That's correct, yeah.
That's unusual to be.
I had actually 2 or 3 PhD students who were older than I was, yeah.
In my discussion with some of the people that you've been their mentor and students and helping them in their research and as a teacher, they have these wonderful comments, working with you, witty, practical, humorous, deeply founded in science engineering. Fantastic comments from those students.
Glad to hear it.
You also have a few female students who've really had some notoriety of late. You want to talk about those two?
Yes. I was counting up the other day how many female students in all I've had, and I think out of the 49 PhD students that I supervise who finished their degrees, I had 5 or 6 female PhD students. And 2 of them have been extremely successful. One of them was Ellen Ochoa. Actually, the 2 successful ones were of the same era. I think they overlapped as graduate students. One of them is Ellen Ochoa, who, after she started as an engineer at Sandia, and she tried out for the astronaut corps, and she didn't make it the first time. And she was told as feedback that if you were working for NASA, you might have a better chance of getting into the astronaut corps. So she moved to Moffett Field, and before you knew it, she's supervising 60 or 70 people. She was extremely well organized, and that helped her enormously. So finally, in the second try, she was chosen for the astronaut corps. She flew on a number of different shuttle flights. It's either 4 or 5, I've forgotten which. Initially, she was a boom operator. You know, they have this big boom that goes out to pick things up. She was a boom operator. I think she was the chief science person on one of them. Anyway, very successful.
Right.
And then, and she was involved in resupplying the space station.
And now she's head of Johnson Space Center?
She became what we would call the provost of Johnson Space Flight Center initially, and then when the director resigned, she became the director. So she's the top person at the Johnson Space Flight Center.
And Christine Johnson?
And she, by the way, was a Stanford trustee for 10 years.
Oh, that's right. Oh,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Christina Johnson?
Christina Johnson. My first memories of Christina are the first day when freshmen arrived on campus. A young lady came kind of jumping and bobbing into my office to show me holograms that she'd made as a senior in high school. And I was sufficiently impressed by her that I actually gave her a research assistantship part-time as an undergraduate. Wow. She then went to graduate school in EE, and I was her supervisor. She did a PhD on holography. She then, when she finished, oh, by the way, she was a very good, she was an athlete. And she was a very good, when you run around with a ball?
Field hockey?
It's not field hockey.
Lacrosse?
Maybe it's lacrosse. No, maybe it was field hockey. You're right, field hockey. Okay. She was a very good field hockey player. But when she left Stanford, she went to the University of Colorado as an assistant professor, and she eventually became professor there. She was subsequently recruited to be Dean of Engineering at Duke, yes. And she helped raise a lot of money for engineering at Duke. Right. She's very well connected in the Valley here. I got to tell you a story about her while she was still a graduate student. The Queen of England came to the Stanford campus for a visit. I don't know what year this was, but and there was a contest. Kennedy was president. There was a contest amongst students, both graduate and undergraduate, to see who would be allowed to meet the Queen. I don't know. I know. She said she wanted to make a hologram of the Queen. She never did that, but that was the project she was interested in.
You're right.
So she was chosen as one of the, I don't know, 20 or 30 students to meet the Queen. And the Queen came, and the only person in the crowd to meet the Queen that was wearing gloves was Christina Johnson. And she was the only one the Queen would shake hands with.
Fantastic. That's a great story.
Yeah.
Then she, after that, then she went to Johns Hopkins?
She went, well, after Duke, she went to Johns Hopkins as provost. She was provost for 2 years at Johns Hopkins, as I recall. Mm-hmm. And then she went as Undersecretary of Energy under Steve Chu to the Department of Energy. And she was in the Department of Energy for 2 or 3 years, and then left to found a company, I've forgotten the name of it, an interesting company that was buying up dams in the U.S. that did not have electrical generation equipment, but that had the potential for electrical generation. And so they bought some big dams and installed the equipment to generate electricity. And that company, I think, was quite successful.
Good.
And then, most recently, she was recruited to be chancellor of the State University of New York system, which is a huge system. I've like 40 campuses or something like that. And she starts, I think, in January, if I'm not mistaken.
That strikes me when you talk about the opportunity to mentor students and women in particular. We know in engineering we'd like to do more of that. Are there things that, from your experience, you think that we could be doing at Stanford and elsewhere a better job of attracting women into fields of engineering or underserved populations?
Well, one of the programs of this kind that I really like is at Foothill College. We may have something like it at Stanford, but they have a STEM summer camp.
Yes, right.
At Foothill College. And they have 1,000 junior high and high school kids who come in and are able to choose between a multitude of different science and math projects. And they spend a week. For those who can't afford it, there's no cost. For those who can afford it, it's a modest cost.
I believe Stanford has some similar programs.
And it's really a great program. My wife and I have actually funded it for the last 3 or 4 years.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Let's go back into the chronology.
So I was just going to finish that thought. Yes. I mean, that is the kind of thing that I think will get kids and women in particular, because there are more women in that program at Foothill than there are men. Yeah. It will get them interested in STEM careers.
There's something interesting that happens with young girls somewhere in their early teens. They tend to lose interest in math, science. So programs like this hopefully will encourage them.
Carry them through that,
So going back to the work as a faculty member, you had an opportunity to take a couple of sabbaticals, one in 72 to 73 in Paris, and then at the University of Sydney in 84. Can you talk a little bit about the experiences on sabbaticals?
Yes. The French experience was really fantastic. For a long time, we kind of felt Paris was our second home. We lived in a small apartment just on the edge of Paris. My daughter, who was 10 years old at the time, did not speak any French when we arrived, of course, but she went to bilingual school. And it seems amazing to me now, but I went with her to school for a week or two so she would know the way. But she had to take a bus to the metro, take the metro several stations to the closest metro to the school, get out of the metro and walk to the school. And I don't think we'd ever let our kids do that today. No. But it worked just perfectly.
What a great experience for her. Right?
Yeah, a great experience for her. And she learned, it was a bilingual school, she learned French. And to this day, she still studies French. She's taking French classes at Alliance Française. So anyway, and of course we visited all the museums in Paris. The French have an incredible number of holidays. And every holiday I bought a Volvo while we were there, and every holiday we'd take a trip to another part of France or something. And then when we were all finished, when the academic year ended, we hopped in the Volvo and we drove to Austria and I was invited to give some talks in Poland, which was before the Iron Curtain had come down. And so, the experience of going through the checkpoints with the guns and so forth was quite memorable.
And you also wrote another book while you...
I started writing a book on statistical optics, yes. The first day I was at the Optics Institute there, the director called me up and he said, "You will give your lectures in French, won't you?"
Yes.
I had taken 1/4 of French in preparation for this before here at Stanford. And I did give my lectures in French. It was extremely painful for the students, I can tell you. In order to do it, I had to abandon all distinction between masculine and feminine. I had to speak in only the present tense. And, the demand for my lectures dropped off rather quickly.
I can identify with that. I used to go to France a lot. My wife and I actually enjoy France more than any place, but I would go and give lectures and presentations on the work I was doing. But it's a different era now that virtually all French now speak English, and that's not an issue, right?
That's right,
So
yeah. I was there just at the end of that era when the French were expected to give their talks in international meetings in French and so forth.
That had to be very hard to do. So what about Sydney? You went there?
Sydney, yes. This was a shorter term sabbatical. I think we were in Sydney for maybe 8 weeks. And we found a very nice apartment there. I had an office at the University of Sydney, gave some talks there. And we like Sydney.
Yeah.
I mean, Australia was a great place.
Fantastic.
Yeah, but I have to tell you that because they were paying me a partial salary, I did not feel free to do all the things the tourists do. No. So we never went to Ayers Rock or any of those places. Right. We've seen less of Australia than the average tourist.
You need to go back. So when you, in 1988, you became chair of the department, and you served for 6 years until 1996.
Yes.
You want to talk a little bit about how you became chair?
It's 8 years.
Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me, 8. Sorry, 8. Thank you.
Right.
How you became chair? Wasn't there a bit of politics in the department? You were sort of surprised you became chair?
That's right. We had a laboratory structure in electrical engineering. I think we had 5 laboratories: STAR, ISL, CS, Information Systems Lab, Computer Systems Lab, Integrated Circuits Lab, Solid State Lab, and each one had a director.
Yes.
And let's see, the sequence was that Bob White had been chair for 2 or 3 years. He left to go to the Exploratorium as director in San Francisco. And Cal Quate was appointed acting chair for 1 year while they looked for a chair. Mm-hmm. And the problem was they had a lot of trouble, the various lab directors consulting with Gibbons, who was the dean, had a lot of trouble identifying somebody they would all want to be chair. And somehow they all settled on me. I don't know exactly why, but a lot of them remember this period of time when they all recommended me to Gibbons, and Gibbons asked me, and I said I'd like to think about it overnight. And he sent out an email to all of them saying, he's thinking about it. He didn't say no.
Did you get lobbied after that from some of your colleagues?
No, I didn't, but it was an interesting challenge. The most interesting thing about it was that for the first time, really, considerable numbers of faculty were in the EE were reaching retirement age. And so there was a lot to be done in the way of new appointments. Right. And that, for me, was the most interesting and pleasureful part of being chairperson.
And that's always a challenge to the chair and the search committees to make sure you're getting the right person and new where people where the new directions and we should
exactly. And so we had an executive committee consisting of the lab director, and myself, and the amazing thing was that even though all the lab directors had somewhat parochial interests in their area, they all wanted what was best for electrical engineering. So we never had big disagreements about, where we need an appointment to be strong. Everybody wanted the department to be strong, right. And I thought that was pretty unusual for a place like Stanford with a lot of big egos and right. so forth. So that was John Hennessy was one of the lab directors, right. Steve Harris, I think, Jim Plummer, maybe.
Was Bob Dutton?
Maybe Bob Dutton was the IC lab director.
I think so. Probably. When I was going back and doing a little bit of reading about what was going on in that era, there was also the time when the faculty members were virtually in revolt over the high cost of overhead and support research.
Yes.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, this was the Kennedy era, yes. And as I understood it, the way overhead was allocated was looked at all the overhead costs across the university and then identified which ones were associated with government contracts and which ones weren't. Right. But everything was in the same pot initially. And I think this was the cause of all this political uproar, because in this pot was this yacht and remodeling of Kennedy's right. something or other.
That's correct.
And really there were two pots, but the two pots were in the same container. And
the burden was increasing for individual faculty members on their grants.
The burden was increasing. I mean, right. That's really important. The faculty was getting upset gradually about the increase of overhead rate, and something had to be done. I should have mentioned this or not? Let's see. It was also a time when the legal office at Stanford seemed to have a lot of power and a lot of say in yes. things. And there came a time when Jim Plummer, who's the most straightforward guy you can imagine, was kind of challenged by the legal office as to whether the accounting was all okay for the Center for Integrated Systems, I think. Yeah. And they advised him to hire a lawyer.
Oh, I didn't. Seriously?
You would have
Jim Plummer?
You would have thought that the university might be the one to defend a faculty member, but yes. They advised him to hire a lawyer. And I wrote a letter which I threatened to send to the news organizations in the area, outlining all of this and saying that if Jim Plummer has to have a lawyer, the EE department will pay for it, and we will make sure that the community knows what's going on. And as far as I know, that was the end of it. I had a frantic call from President Kennedy, saying, I don't know what he said, but
that's a fantastic story.
It got a lot of attention, I can tell you. Yeah.
Of all people, Jim, I worked with Jim for 12 years.
Jim's the most
straightforward guy. I can't imagine. That's interesting. So going back to this issue of the overhead, I know then there was the controversy with Don Kennedy. He got in trouble with the Fed's overhead. And eventually Gerhard took over for Don after that. The other thing that I looked at back in '92, you chaired a committee on the structure and functions of the standing committees of the Academic Council, and you recommended the creation of a planning and policy board. Do you recall that?
No, I don't remember.
Then we won't talk about it. But something about that you. My recollection was that you were worried that the faculty senate was thinking in a very sort of short-sighted way, wasn't thinking a bit more strategically and bigger picture, and you thought that this planning policy.
You sure it wasn't the committee on research that did this?
I had standing committees of academic, the committee on the structure and functions of the standing committees of the Academic Council.
Okay, I don't remember that at all. But
we'll have people in the future who want to know about it. Go back to the historical record, go to the news service, and dig it out.
It slipped my mind. Maybe it was a bad experience.
Maybe it was. So then.
I did want to mention. You mentioned Gerhard.
Yeah.
I was on the search committee.
Tell
for
me
Gerhard.
About that. Yeah.
That was a great experience. Who did we have on that search committee? We had Condoleezza Rice. Yes. We had Steve Chu. We had Rosenberg from medicine, as I recall, and a student. And anyway, we took we broke up into little subgroups and took trips around the country to talk to people we thought might possibly be candidates, but we approached them by asking them for advice. You know, we're searching for a president.
That's
what
good.
advice would you give
that's
us?
good.
You know?
That's good.
And so we did that. We went to Canada. We went to New York City. We went, and when the time came, and all of this time we were trying to hide from the student newspaper, so they wouldn't know what we were doing.
Did you feel a bit of an imperative to look outside of Stanford, which
Yes.
traditionally is hired from in-house?
Yes.
And so that was
well, we certainly considered some in-house candidates,
right.
but I think the major candidates were outside.
And that was an era where there was a sort of a looking for a fresh perspective.
Well,
maybe?
that's exactly right. I mean, we'd been through this overhead controversy, and we were in trouble with the government and so forth. We felt we needed an outsider, I think, to straighten it all out. And I do recall the last when we had the interview with Gerhardt. It was held in a building that Peter Bing owns, I think, down in Los Angeles. And you know, we flew on separate. We separate ourselves. Flew on separate flights, and we contemplated wearing fake noses and so forth.
That's funny. That's a great story.
Yeah.
So Gerhardt came on, and then you also, after chair, you became the senior associate dean.
Right.
But that was the era where there was lots of discussion about new approaches to building bridges between disciplines. That was when the discussions began about how the engineering could work with the medical and the life sciences people. And then there was the cross-discipline approach with image systems engineering and with psychology, ECS.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about your thinking at that time and the school and the university's thinking about this cross-discipline approach?
Yeah, that's right. I think what you're referring to was taking place sort of at the end of my term as senior associate dean. What I remember from, you know, as a big change in the School of Engineering from this would be when I was still chair, and Jim Gibbons was dean. There was a merger of two departments. There was a merger of what were the two departments? One was it industrial engineering? Industrial engineering management, engineering economic systems, and operations research. Well, that was when three of them. But first there were two.
Right.
And I forget which two it was. Right. But eventually, I guess under John Hennessy,
yes,
there was a third one that joined. And
that's correct.
That was initially very painful for the faculty members involved. They didn't like it at all because they all had their own way of doing things.
I know.
And I think it worked out beautifully from everything I hear.
It was
the faculty is very happy with the way
now
it turned
is,
out.
but it was.
But initially,
quite torturous. It was very hard.
Elizabeth Pate-Cornell managed that whole thing, and got to hand it to her. She must have a lot of talent in bringing people together.
I was in the dean's office at that time, and the conversations around our weekly luncheon meetings was always around how can Elizabeth continue this balancing act of trying to bring people together with incentives and rewards and to do it. It was tricky. I give her a lot of credit. It was pulled off, and right now it seems reasonably seamless from what I can see about it. Were you involved with image systems engineering, though?
Yes, Brian Wendell and I started the
sure.
idea of image systems engineering, and we both had interests in that field, and we managed to get a few companies to provide some funds to support a kind of center in that area.
Right.
And eventually Brian's wife became the executive director. Joyce Farrell was the executive director. And that's been very successful. Joyce has done a wonderful job.
It's now a center.
I don't know what it is now.
I think it's a center for image systems engineering.
That's good. I'm glad.
I think it is.
Yeah.
One of the things that you had a chance to do as a faculty member, and then also you were involved in when you were chair was that you and your colleagues taught classes to industry on the Stanford Instructional Television Network.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that experience and the relationship that you had, not just with the television part of it, but the relationships that you and your colleagues had with industry? And then in a moment, I want to come to how you were involved in starting some companies. But just that first, maybe the teaching on television part.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, the teaching on television was no problem. I think, you know, I moved from writing on the blackboard to writing on the overhead pad.
That's correct.
Was much easier to do it that way. And the few students out in industry were kind of invisible a lot of the time. Occasionally we'd get a question coming in.
That's correct.
We'd see no lips moving, so we knew it must come from somewhere outside. But it was no extra burden. And I thought the system worked well.
You may recall that was also an era where we began some work with electrical engineering faculty members where in that department we brought on the first online engineering graduate degree. It was the extension of television. It became very primitive. It was the very beginning of delivering video on the internet. And so that's something that is a good check mark for the E department that had the world's first graduate engineering
that was
degree.
right sort of at the end of my tenure
That's
as
correct.
senior associate dean, I think. And
it was Anoop Gupta. He had a company,
Extreme.
Extreme. It was a test bed.
Yes, that's right.
And
I remember that now.
I remember it was quite dramatic. We had people from all around the world wanting to see what we were doing.
Yeah. Right. One thing about SITN I want to mention, it was a great revenue source for electrical engineering. Right. We were a profit center. We made a lot of money in electrical engineering in those days.
Right.
And when I was chair, I actually put $2 million out of the department into funds functioning as endowment, which was not. There weren't too many departments able to do that at that time.
Those were monies that became discretionary monies for chairs that were used in all sorts of ways like that.
Yes.
Just to give you a data point, the last year I was director of, which now became the Stanford Center for Professional Development. The enterprise was generating close to $30 million a year for the university and the academic departments in the school. Yeah. So it jumped up dramatically, and the departments really relied on those monies in a discretionary way. Which worked well.
And is that still true with the internet-based?
It is. In fact, in many ways, it's even more dramatic because it's so much easier for you to gain access through your computer. You still have my understanding. The standards, if you get admitted to the Honors Corps program, is still the same. But now you have greater flexibility,
I understand,
and you don't have to do it live. It's in an
But the Honors Corps program went through a peak and then diminished.
That's right.
It hasn't come back up.
No, not as strong as early on when you were there.
Yeah.
There was something else during that time when you were, I think, when you were in the faculty senate, you were a lead around an issue that surfaced about copyrights and significant use of university services, resources, and copyright. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was the Committee on Research, I believe.
Yes, I think that's correct.
And, that was a thorny issue because the issue now, I'm beginning to recall, was that there were faculty members who were in their consulting day were working for companies that offered courses. So, they would teach what was essentially their Stanford course in a for-profit environment. And the question was, what rights did Stanford have to that sort of thing? Right. But to complicate it more, if you just say Stanford has rights to everything, then books that faculty publish would be owned by Stanford, and that would not go over well with the faculty at all. Correct. So I don't even remember what our recommendations were, but we had to sort of carve out what is Stanford's and what is the faculty's.
I think the resolution, the conclusion was something that was reasonable. I think the faculty members accepted it and the university did. And I've not seen it, but when I read about it, there was some tension around that.
Yeah. There was.
Yeah. the other, when you, in your career, you had a chance to work with 4 different deans: Joe Pettit, Jim Gibbons, John Hennessy, and Jim Plummer. Can you
Oh,
talk
you've forgotten one.
who did I forget? Oh, Pettit, Gibbons, Hennessy.
Kays.
Oh, I didn't know you were. Oh, you worked with them? I didn't know that.
Well,
Yeah.
oh,
And-
work with them. What do you mean by
well,
work
I mean,
with them?
you,
I didn't
it's-
work
it's-
with Pettit.
correct. I think you had an experience to either observe them in action or some of them you worked with.
And Kays was one of them.
Case was the other. So let's talk about the ones you did work with. That would be Jim Gibbons, Hennessy,
Yeah.
right? Did you work with Jim as when Jim was in the department? But he became dean after you had stepped down as a senior associate dean, or was
He being,
Plummer?
Plummer became dean. I was actually acting dean for the summer between
Summer of 2000,
when,
yes.
yeah,
Right.
when John Hennessy went to be provost, and Plummer wasn't quite ready yet to step into dean.
That's
So I
right.
served as acting dean for one summer.
So you had a chance though to work with Joe Pettit and Jim Gibbons. Is that right?
Not Joe Pettit.
Not Joe Pettit?
He was, I was a graduate student.
So
when
Jim
Joe Pettit
Gibbons
was
and
here.
John Hennessy. So
Yes.
So in observing deans and observing leadership
Mm-hmm.
of chairs and all, can you talk about the experience of working with those leaders, people that you saw in action? What was
Yes.
it? What
Yes.
did you see that you thought was worked well, where
Yeah.
they may have struggled, anything
Yeah.
like that?
Well, let me mention Bill Kays first, because he did something that I thought had an impact on a lot of faculty, and that was he got them into the computer age
Oh,
by saying that the School of Engineering would buy you a computer, a personal computer.
really?
Yeah, or maybe it was they'd pay for 50%, or I think, I don't quite remember how much of the computer he bought,
Right.
but it was an incentive
Wow.
for all the faculty to have personal computers. And there were a lot of faculty that didn't have personal computers, and it helped bring faculty into the computer age, I think. So I think that's an accomplishment of Bill Kays. For Jim Gibbons, Jim was a very good leader. I think people respected him a lot. He had high standards, appointments and promotions. You had to have I was a chair at that time. You had to have a pretty good case. And I forget how many, we had to have something like 8 or 10 outside letters of reference for any new appointment, or for any promotion for that matter, as I recall. And if you had 9 raving letters that said this guy is superb, and you had one that said he's okay, then you had to get another 5 or 6. You had to really build a case, and so I admired Jim for that. And he was a good fundraiser too, Jim. Very good fundraiser.
I know he was.
Yeah.
Exceptional.
And then for John Hennessy, I thought John had terrific standards. He could look at a appointment or promotion case, and he could see the strengths and weaknesses just like that. Very sharp. Also a great fundraiser. He managed to bring that 3rd department into the new department.
Right, and that's right. Management Science and Engineering was.
Yeah,
was the
that's right.
department,
That's right. And I don't know. I admired John tremendously. Part of my admiration comes from his time as dean, and part from his time as president.
And you had good working relationships.
Oh, we had a great working relationship.